The Young and the Restless spoilers shock Thurdays full November 6, 2025. The moment Nick saw the man standing in front of him, the fragile boundary between disbelief and certainty shattered. For days, he had tried to convince himself that Sharon's fears were just trauma resurfacing, a symptom of the shock they had all endured since Noah's accident. But when he looked into Matt's eyes, or rather, into the face that had once belonged to Mitch Bacall, the man he had buried in the past, there was no denying what his instincts screamed. It wasn't resemblance or coincidence. It was him. The same sharpness in his gaze, the same arrogance masked behind a faint, mocking calm, the same slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that used to appear whenever he felt in control. Nick's breath slowed as realization settled like ice in his veins. Mitch was alive. He had changed his name, his story, his entire identity, but nothing could erase the imprint of the man who had once tried to destroy everything the Newmans held dear. And now he was standing inside the same hospital where Noah had just awakened from the brink of death. Matt, or Mitch, whichever name he was hiding behind, didn't flinch when he saw Nick's reaction. In fact, he seemed almost entertained by it, as though he had orchestrated the moment just to watch Nick unravel. His voice was calm, too calm, the tone of a man who understood the power of restraint and used it as a weapon. He spoke softly, pretending confusion, tilting his head slightly as if he couldn't comprehend why Nick's fists clenched or why Sharon's entire body tensed beside him. He tried to play the role of the misunderstood visitor, the man unfairly accused, the concerned acquaintance who had come merely to express sympathy. But his eyes betrayed him. There was a gleam there, sharp and knowing, the unmistakable glint of a predator who recognized the scent of fear. Nick, however, was not the same man he had been years ago. Time had hardened him, burned away the hesitation that once made him believe people could change simply because they claimed redemption. He had lived through too many lies, buried too many bodies of trust, to fall for that kind of performance again. He could feel Sharon trembling beside him, could sense the invisible wall of memories she was trying to keep from crumbling. Every breath she took was a silent confession of guilt, every flicker in her eyes a sign that she had known this confrontation was inevitable. The air between them thickened, tense enough to snap. Nick's voice, low and rough, broke the silence like a blade sliding from its sheath. He asked questions not to receive answers, but to expose them, questions laced with accusation, years of repressed rage condensed into each word. Who sent you here? Why now? What did you do to Noah? And every time Matt tried to respond with his rehearsed calm, Nick pushed harder, his tone sharper, his stance closer. The line between threat and warning blurred as his body leaned forward, forcing Matt to step back, his mask of composure cracking for the first time. Sharon's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She had begged Nick to stay calm, to think before acting, but she knew it was useless. The moment he saw Mitch's face, all reason would vanish. There was too much history, too much pain tied to that man, years of betrayal, deceit, manipulation, and destruction that no apology could erase. She tried to hold Nick's arm, to steady him, but her voice came out hollow. Her mind was a storm of contradictions. She knew Matt's presence was dangerous, yet a small, reluctant part of her still feared what would happen if Nick lost control. Matt straightened, forcing a thin smile as he tried to reclaim the upper hand. He told Nick he was mistaken, that he was letting grief cloud his judgment, that not every shadow from the past was worth chasing. It was psychological warfare, subtle but lethal, and he played it with the precision of a man who had studied every weakness his opponent possessed. He shifted his tone to one of pity, suggesting that Nick was too fragile, too emotional to see reason. He even implied that Sharon's nerves were making her imagine connections that didn't exist. For a moment, he almost sounded convincing. But then Nick caught the faintest slip, a phrase, a gesture, something only Mitch would say, and that was enough to ignite him completely. The confrontation could have turned violent if Sharon hadn't stepped between them, her voice trembling as she ordered Matt to leave. Her fear wasn't only for Nick but for what might be exposed if this spiraled further. Because deep inside, Sharon carried a secret about Matt that no one else fully understood, one that could change everything if it came to light. She had tried to bury it long ago, but his sudden reappearance meant the past was no longer content to stay silent. As Matt finally turned and walked away, his expression unreadable, she felt a wave of dread that left her dizzy. Meanwhile, across the hospital, Victoria Newman stood by the window of the waiting room, staring at the faint reflection of her own anxious face against the glass. The news of Noah's awakening had brought her immense relief, but it hadn't erased the gnawing suspicion in her gut. Something about the accident didn't fit. The reports were vague, the timeline strange, and every answer seemed to lead to a new question. She remembered the night it happened, the phone call from Sharon, the chaos, the uncertainty. But what haunted her now were the inconsistencies, the unexplained tire marks, the missing surveillance footage, and the witnesses who suddenly couldn't recall what they had seen. The deeper she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just a tragic accident. Someone had wanted it to happen. Victoria had seen enough corporate sabotage, enough family betrayal, to recognize a setup when she saw one. And now, with Sharon's behavior becoming increasingly guarded and Nick's temper growing volatile, she knew that the truth was being kept from her. The only question was, why? She couldn't shake the image of Sharon's pale face when she mentioned Matt's name, or the tremor in her voice whenever the topic came up. Sharon was a woman haunted, and Victoria intended to find out by what. Later that afternoon, as the hospital halls grew quieter, Victoria found Sharon sitting alone outside Noah's room, her hands clasped tightly together as if trying to hold herself together. Victoria approached cautiously, aware that one wrong word could send her retreating into silence. She began with small talk, concern for Noah, admiration for his strength, but her real intent was buried beneath her calm tone. She wanted to know about Matt. She wanted confirmation of the rumor that the man long thought dead was alive and walking among them. Sharon hesitated. Her eyes flickered, betraying the internal war she had fought for weeks. Admitting the truth meant reopening wounds that had barely healed, and worse, it meant acknowledging her own complicity in keeping it hidden. But Victoria's persistence left her cornered. Finally, her voice broke the silence, low and almost trembling, as she whispered what she had tried so hard to deny, that Matt Clark was alive. That he had changed his identity, inserted himself back into their world under a different name, and that she feared he had something to do with Noah's accident. Victoria's blood ran cold. It wasn't just shock that gripped her, but the awareness of what this revelation meant. Matt Clark had been one of the darkest chapters in their family's history, a manipulator who thrived on psychological destruction. If he was back, then everything they had rebuilt was in danger again. She thanked Sharon quietly, masking the dread behind professionalism, but as she walked away, her mind raced. She needed to warn Nick, to protect the family before the situation spiraled out of control. Inside Noah's room, the young man stirred again, the soft beeping of the monitor steadying. His thoughts were disjointed, fragments of memory floating like broken glass through his mind. He remembered the crash, the blinding light, the voice that called his name just before everything went black. And somewhere in that haze, he could still hear Matt, whispering something he couldn't quite recall, something that felt like both a warning and a threat. The more he tried to remember, the more his head throbbed, but one thought persisted: the accident wasn't an accident at all. Nick stood at the foot of the bed, still consumed by anger, but underneath it was fear that his family was once again the target of something bigger than they could see. He looked down at his son, at Sharon sitting silently beside him, and at the door Matt had disappeared through hours earlier. Every instinct told him that the nightmare wasn't over. Mitch Emmett, whatever name he wore now, had returned for a reason, and this time, his game was just beginning. As the night deepened, Victoria made a call to an old contact in the police department, requesting a quiet review of the accident files. Sharon sat motionless in the dark, staring at the hospital monitors, replaying every word Matt had said. And Nick, unable to sleep, stood outside under the pale glow of the parking lot lights, his thoughts spiraling between fury and guilt. The storm they thought they had escaped years ago had found them again, and the line between past and present was vanishing fast. Somewhere in the shadows of Genoa City, Matt Clark smiled to himself, his plan moving forward exactly as intended. Every piece was falling into place: Noah's accident, Sharon's panic, Nick's rage, Victoria's suspicion. He thrived on their chaos, on watching them destroy themselves trying to uncover what he had already set in motion. And as the night wind howled through the city, one truth became clear: Matt had not returned for revenge. He had returned for control. The morning sunlight crept reluctantly into Genoa City, casting long, fractured shadows across glass towers and silent streets that still remembered the chaos of the night before. Inside one of the city's upscale townhouses, Sienna Bacall sat at her dining table, her gaze lost in the swirl of steam rising from the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. The air felt heavy, almost fragile, like it might shatter with the faintest sound. She didn't hear her husband's footsteps at first, only the quiet clink of porcelain as Mitch placed another cup beside her. His presence, though familiar, carried a tension that didn't belong to morning domesticity. When he spoke, his tone was calm, practiced, every word measured like a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of deception. She looked up slowly, her expression blank but her mind racing. "Good morning, Mitch," she said softly, her voice laced with something brittle. Or should I say Matt? The name hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that came not from comfort but from control. He leaned back against the counter, arms folded loosely, eyes trained on her with that same unnerving steadiness. He claimed he didn't understand why Nick Newman had accused him of being someone else, that this confusion was just another of Nick's paranoid crusades, the kind he'd made a reputation of waging against ghosts. But Sienna wasn't so easily convinced. She had seen the cracks forming in his facade, the sleepless nights, the strange phone calls, the way he avoided questions about his past while pretending transparency. When he said he missed her because she hadn't come home the previous night, his words carried both affection and accusation. Sienna's pulse quickened. She had told him she needed space, that she was meeting a client, but in truth, she had driven aimlessly through the night, suffocating under the weight of a marriage that had started to feel like a lie. Across town, Nick Newman was standing in the dim light of Sharon's hotel suite, holding a small paper bag and a box of scones, trying to pretend this was an ordinary morning. The scent of coffee and pastries filled the room, but the conversation that followed was anything but casual. Sharon, still caught between hope and dread after Noah's fragile recovery, sat at the edge of the couch, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Nick's presence was both comfort and reminder. Comfort because he had always been the anchor she could lean on, reminder because everything about their lives had become a maze of old ghosts and new suspicions. He told her he'd be visiting his father later, trying to sound detached, but his tone betrayed a simmering undercurrent of unrest. Sharon knew that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was about to make a decision that could change everything. She asked gently what he planned to do next, and his jaw tightened before he answered. He said he couldn't shake the feeling that Matt Clark was alive, that the man pretending to be Mitch Bacall wasn't just a stranger with bad timing but a calculated threat walking freely among them. Sharon's heart sank. She had heard that name too many times in whispers and half-remembered nightmares. Matt Clark was the ghost that refused to stay buried, a manipulator who thrived on chaos and psychological destruction. She warned Nick not to go looking for him, not yet, not while emotions were this raw. But Nick only smirked with a trace of dark humor, the kind that comes from anger barely contained. He said he planned to visit the dark room, the exclusive club Mitch managed, unannounced. Sharon's instinctive dread tightened like a fist in her chest. She could already picture the confrontation, the simmering hostility that would eventually ignite. Nick's parting grin didn't ease her fears, it only deepened them. At the same time, the city's most polished establishment, the Grand Phoenix, came alive with the morning rush of whispers, clinking glasses, and carefully veiled gossip. In the restaurant's sunlit corner, Claire Grace sat across from Nikki and Victoria Newman, both women exuding their usual blend of poise and quiet power. Claire, however, was not herself. Her laughter was forced, her movements sluggish, her complexion pale under the flattering light. She admitted with a self-deprecating chuckle that she might have had too much to drink the night before. Nikki's expression softened, she understood that particular regret too well. The matriarch who had survived more than her share of demons reached across the table and told Claire she knew what it meant to wake up in the morning and face the cost of losing control. The exchange was gentle, but beneath the words lay a subtle echo of warning. Victoria watched quietly, reading both of them with the same sharp intuition that made her such an effective leader at Newman Enterprises. She could sense there was more behind Claire's fatigue than a night of indulgence. Elsewhere in the hotel, Holden Novak stood by the reception desk, phone in hand, the weight of bad news pulling his posture down like gravity. The call had been short, too short, but its implications were heavy. A deal he'd been working on for months had fallen through, sabotaged by a mysterious investor who had withdrawn at the last moment. He didn't need to ask who. Every instinct told him Mitch Bacall had something to do with it. For weeks, Holden had suspected Mitch was involved in far more than business, that beneath the suave persona and philanthropic charm was a man connected to darker networks operating in Genoa City's shadows. Now, that suspicion felt dangerously close to confirmation. Back in the Bacall residence, the atmosphere between Mitch and Sienna shifted from uneasy to electric. She rose from her seat, circling the table slowly, her movements deliberate, as if trying to gauge whether the man before her was still the husband she once knew or an impostor hiding behind his face. Mitch tried to bridge the silence with affection, reaching for her hand, but Sienna pulled away. Her mind flashed back to small inconsistencies, a scar on his wrist that hadn't been there before, a story about his childhood that didn't align with what he once told her, the way he sometimes spoke in a tone that didn't belong to Mitch at all. Every fragment of doubt was now aligning into a picture she could no longer ignore. The man she had married might not exist at all. Meanwhile, Sharon arrived at the hospital to check on Noah, though her thoughts were miles away. The hum of machines, the steady beeping of monitors, and the scent of antiseptic all faded into a haze as she replayed her last conversation with Nick. He was going after Matt, or Mitch, whatever name the man used now, and nothing she said would stop him. Her pulse raced with the memory of the last time Nick had gone head-to-head with someone consumed by vengeance. He was fearless, yes, but fearlessness could so easily bleed into recklessness. She knew that the confrontation brewing between him and Mitch would not end in words. At that very moment, Mitch sat alone in his study, staring at his reflection in the dark surface of a coffee mug. His mind was a maze of calculation. He had built this second life carefully, new name, new history, new wife, and yet, despite all the layers of disguise, the past had a way of clawing its way back. Nick Newman was the variable he had underestimated. The man's persistence bordered on obsession, and Mitch knew that soon, his cover would collapse entirely. But even that didn't frighten him. He thrived on control, on staying one move ahead, and if exposure was inevitable, he would ensure that when the truth emerged, it would destroy his enemies before it destroyed him. He had planted enough seeds of doubt to divide them, Sharon's guilt, Nick's rage, Sienna's suspicion, and when the time came, those fractures would widen until the entire Newman circle turned against itself. Back at the Grand Phoenix, the Newmans' breakfast continued with polite conversation that barely masked growing unease. Victoria's mind was elsewhere, spinning through the implications of Sharon's confession from the night before, the possibility that Matt Clark was alive. If true, it meant a threat far greater than anyone understood. Nikki, sensing her daughter's distraction, tried to draw her back into small talk, but even she could feel the shift in the air. The world they had rebuilt around family, business, and forgiveness was beginning to tremble again, as if the sins of the past were demanding payment in full. As the morning slipped into afternoon, Nick arrived at the dark room, the private club Mitch owned, a place known for its selective clientele and dangerous discretion. The low light, the murmuring voices, and the faint scent of expensive whiskey made it feel more like a lair than a lounge. Mitch was waiting for him. The two men locked eyes, the tension between them crackling like static before a storm. Neither spoke for several long seconds, but in that silence, the history between them roared louder than words ever could. Mitch greeted him with forced civility, but Nick saw through the performance instantly. This was not a reunion. It was a declaration of war. Back at home, Sienna stood by the window, watching the street below, her reflection fractured by sunlight. For years, she had believed she understood her husband, his ambitions, his flaws, his charm. But now, every memory felt corrupted, every gesture suspect. She thought about the name she had spoken that morning, Matt Clark, and how it had made him pause for just a second too long before recovering. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know. Her husband wasn't just lying. He was living a lie.